Welcome. I'm David Howell, and I'll be stepping in. I'm not Janet Gornick. I'll be stepping in for Janet, who couldn't make it because of family matters. And I'll be introducing this conversation between Eduardo Porter, an exceptional columnist for the New York Times, and Stephen Hill about Steve's new book, Raw Deal: How the Uber Economy and Naked Capitalism Are Screwing American Workers. In addition to being an old friend and colleague of Janet's, pardon me, I'm going to read this because I've got a 5-minute limit and it's already probably 7, so I'm going to try to do this quickly. In addition to being an old friend and colleague of Janet's, I'm a professor at the New School, right down Fifth Avenue, specializing in labor economics and social policy. This year I have the privilege of being here at the Graduate Center as an ARC Fellow and as a LIS Center visiting scholar. So ARC stands for Advanced Research Collaborative, on which Eduardo is a board member. And LIS stands for the Luxembourg Income Study. So this event is sponsored by LIS, the LIS Center here at CUNY's Graduate Center, which Janet directs. LIS has pioneered the development of consistent cross-national data for the study of income distribution and poverty. It's a data center that serves a global community of researchers, educators, and policymakers. Now I get to say what Janet would not say, which is that under her leadership, LIS has taken off to dramatically higher levels of prominence for the study of income inequality, which is increasingly recognized as one of the most serious social problems in the modern era, and the reason most of you are here tonight. She's helped enlist the renowned English economist Anthony Atkinson, who long ago should have won the Nobel Prize, as the president of the LIS board, and she played a central role in bringing Paul Krugman, who did win the Nobel Prize, to LIS and the Graduate Center, and of course he's also a hugely influential New York Times columnist and colleague of Eduardo's. She also helped bring Branko Milanovic to LIS from the World Bank. Branko is without doubt one of the top researchers in the world on global income inequality, and according to my students, also a fabulous teacher. And she helps put on great events like this one. So welcome, Eduardo Porter and Stephen Hill. If you don't read Porter's New York Times column religiously every Wednesday, you're making a very big mistake. On a variety of topics, from income inequality to technological change in jobs, to education and wages, to the crazy American politics of global warming, Porter's columns are great, incredibly rich with information and balanced in perspective, although if I like him so much, perhaps they're not perfectly balanced. I am a New School economist after all. We're very fortunate to have Stephen Hill here to talk about his new book, Raw Deal. Stephen's a senior fellow with the New America Foundation and a Holtzbrinck fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. He's a veteran journalist and author of 5 books, including the internationally praised Europe's Promise: Why the European Way is the Best Hope in an Insecure Age, which was selected as one of the top 15 books of 2010 by The Globalist. So Raw Deal is an important and incredibly timely book, and it happens also to be important and timely for me. I'm here at the Graduate Center working on what I call the Decent Wage Project, funded by the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. The project aims to document in great demographic detail the spectacular growth in lousy jobs, and consequently the decline in decent ones, that we've seen since in the post-1980 neoliberal policy era. Our big questions are, how do we, the US, compare to 5 other large, rich, diverse countries in the translation of economic growth into decent jobs? What explains our decent job performance, and what, or lack of it, and what lessons can we learn from the recent experiences of Canada, the UK, Australia, Germany, and France? In the earlier post-war golden age period, economists could just call for more growth and be confident that it would trickle down throughout the workforce and across the income distribution. But since about 1980, there's been virtually no sharing of economic growth. It's all gone to the top 10% and mostly to the top 1%. the Republican presidential candidates continue in their knee-jerk fashion, see how balanced I am, to call for tax cuts to spur growth to solve the inequality and low-wage problems. But whatever you think about the effectiveness of tax cuts, and yes, Eduardo has also written brilliantly about this, the simple fact is that from the point of view of the bottom half of the wage distribution, changes in the growth rate don't matter much, since economic growth hasn't been shared, and we're also experiencing a decline in redistribution through social spending from the top to the middle and bottom. In sum, there's been a profound underlying ideological shift to free market fundamentalism, which has led to policy and corporate governance choices that have dramatically weakened worker bargaining power. That's the vision that frames our project, and that's what you're going to be hearing about in Stephen Hill's discussion with Eduardo and the book you're going to read. So for me, Stephen Hill's book promises to be a tremendous resource, detailing at a granular level how this process has worked out, while pointing the way to how workers can once again share in our nation's productivity growth. Eduardo and Stephen will now have a conversation about the book and the issues raised by it. I will join you in the audience here. And then at 7:30 sharp, if not before, I'll return up here and help to manage the question and answer part of the discussion, for which we've been allocated 15 minutes till 7:45. And at that point, Steve will sign books, starting with mine. Thanks.
Hi, good evening, guys. Hi, Steve. Thanks a lot for the introduction. Well, Steve has offered us, has written up a really great, impassioned book. He's offering us like a technological dystopia that pushes hard against, the libertarian happy talk that one hears so often from Silicon Valley about how technology is going to be great for all and deliver this fantastically prosperous world. And it has a really strong proposition that I'd like to read to you, like in a nutshell. What if smart machines and robots could perform every single job there is to do, and sharing economy websites could deliver all the services and goods so that no human had to work at a job anymore? Who would reap the benefit of this unimaginably enormous productivity increase? So this is the question that he sets out to answer. And he does it very interestingly, mixing in enormously detailed accounts of real people, some of which actually have struck very near home to me. I'm a journalist, I make a living out of writing, and you've got this story of this, Pulitzer Prize winning photographer that suddenly loses his job in San Francisco and suddenly has to resort to, to renting out bits of his home on Airbnb and driving people around in his car via Uber and considering renting out his equipment via some other web sharing site. And so if that's happening to journalists, then the world is really going into a bad place. But my question is, here is it's hard to tell how significant these different examples or these different dynamics happening in certain markets and with certain services. Does this really look like the way for the future on a massive scale for our labor market? Or maybe this is more of an exception? I mean, how do you feel about this really becoming the norm of work?
Well, whenever you're trying to sift through huge amounts of data and stories and then sort of project where we are today and where we'll be 10 years from now, 20 years from now, I mean, everyone's got their crystal ball out, and no one knows who's going to be right. But what I wanted to do in this book was I wanted to make it really clear what's at stake. Everyone can agree on that we're about to go through a transformation of our economy, our society. Technology is going to be used in a way that penetrates into every corner of our lives in a way that we never would have conceived of. They're going to be wanting to put things into our bodies, nanobots that are going to keep track of our health. They're going to want to, have our cars that drive themselves. They're going to want, on and on and on. You've probably seen, all of you have read different stories. And so I was looking at all these different threads of the dialogue that's been going on, and wanted to put it all together into some sort of picture in which it was clear of what's at stake. You know, my fear is that we're going to look back 20 years from now, and we're going to say, wow, we didn't get that right. We didn't put the right rules and regulations around the technologies that are coming and the companies who are pushing them to make sure that we end up with a society that works for all of us instead of just for a handful. Because as that part you read, you know, if we have all these unimaginable labor productivity increases, you know, who will benefit? Whose pockets will that flow into? If we look at the last 30 years, in fact, I was doing a radio show not that long ago, and someone said, you know, someone talking about there'll be a guaranteed minimum livable wage, $25,000, $30,000 a year. I mean, what would be wrong with that if we all got $25,000, $30,000 to live on, and then we could all do our art and our culture and all these sorts of things? And I said, they haven't even given you a pay increase in the last 25 years. You know, the political system hasn't managed to harness the economic system in a way to make that happen. So what makes you think that somehow the political system is going to somehow harness the economic system in a way that's going to turn over a guaranteed livable wage to anybody, you know, without more struggle and more people getting involved and saying this is not right, this is not good. So, you know, that's, you know, fundamentally what I wanted to write about in the book. And to do that, I looked at a lot of people's stories. As you said, Chris Young, an auto worker in Tennessee working for Nissan. He's working, doing the exact same job as the Nissan worker who's got the Nissan shirt on, but he doesn't have the Nissan shirt because he's working for a contractor. And he's doing the exact same job. He's getting half the pay, barely any safety net at all. He's, you know, has no job security. You probably, a lot of you have heard about Google buses and such out in San Francisco and Facebook buses. What you haven't heard about is the drivers that drive those buses. They don't work for Google and Facebook. They work for a contractor. And that contractor has told them, you've got to report to work by 5:30 in the morning, and your day doesn't end till 9:30 at night. You don't get to see your kids when you wake up in the morning or when you come home at night because they're already in bed for school. And so they don't violate the federal wage laws about how many hours you can work a day. They make them take 4 hours off in the middle of the day. And they don't live close enough, most of them, to go home for those 4 hours. They don't allow them to get a second job during those 4 hours. So they just have to hang around the parking lot. They're basically in indentured servitude, these sorts of jobs. So there's lots of stories about people like this as they are grappling with these trends in our economy that are, you know, for a lot of people are not working. I even have a quote from Tina Brown in there, you know, the media mogul, where she says, you know, me and a lot of my friends, we all started doing the, you know, the freelance thing. And it's, you know, for the first 6 months, everyone says, oh, it's great, I love the flexibility. She says a year later, no one writes that story anymore. So this is, you know, these are the things that are happening.
In fact, I just recently heard the craziest job that I've heard of this new ilk. I don't know if you talk about it in the book. I didn't see it here. I heard it on the radio. Was this service called Invisible Girlfriend, where people will, you know, be your, well, this service will be your girlfriend, and it turns out that it can be very many people that are just texting you, earning pennies on the text, to say, yes, honey, I love you, or, you know, let's meet up later, or something, so that you can show your friends that you have a girlfriend.
Right, I do write about this, not that particular business, but, you know, in the sharing economy, also now known as the gig economy, on-demand economy, peer-to-peer economy, it's got all these names, you have gigs. That's what it's called. Gig is just, you know, you contract with someone through this service, whether it's Uber, Lyft, TaskRabbit, to do various odd jobs. And then they come up with micro gigs because the algorithms are getting so good at squishing jobs down into just smaller and smaller bits, so they can pay you for smaller and smaller bits. And now they have nano gigs. Nano gigs are, you go on places like Mechanical Turk on Amazon and others, and you can do jobs where you identify photos for 5 cents a photo, and you identify. So when people are doing searches on the search engines, and you type in a keyword, it assigns that word to you know, a particular type of shoes: pointed shoes, rounded shoes, a handbag with brown, handbag that's black, a cat lying on a carpet, a cat lying on a couch. They're just assigning these different terms to photos. And in fact, here's the beauty. Get ready for this. You can do it in your spare time. They call it monetizing your downtime. How about that? How about that? Monetizing your downtime. You can do it standing in line at Starbucks. You can do it while you're waiting on the bus. You can do it if you're waiting at the doctor's office. Why waste time? What good is spare time? Who needs that? It doesn't pay anything. You can sit there identifying photos and getting, your rate of pay will be about $2 or $3 per hour if you're good. So these are the nano gigs that they have lined up for. I mean, here's the other thing to keep in mind when it comes, especially when it comes to the sharing economy, gig economy stuff, and Uber and Lyft and TaskRabbit. The thing that they don't want to address, and I've tried to get them to address it, is that, if you work for a traditional job, you go to that job and you're paid, say, 9 to 5, and everything you do between those hours is paid time. That includes meetings with your coworkers. That means, a lunch break or well, maybe not a lunch break, but a break that you get. It means, time talking in the hallway with your coworkers, brainstorming ideas. It means just hanging around the water cooler for a little bit. That's all paid time. In this new gig economy, you're not getting paid for any of that. The only time you're paid for is the time you are absolutely productive, producing that report, producing that image if you're a graphic designer. It'd be as if Eli Manning was paid only when he throws a touchdown pass, which hasn't been happening very much lately, I guess. So his pay would be low indeed. You're only being paid for that productive time. This is a profound transformation of how we conceive of work that they are proposing to us as a society, to say that this is how we should construct work going forward. Because this is what they're saying is, and what they'll tell you is it's liberating you to have more flexibility. You'll get to work when you want. You don't want to work, you turn off the app, right? They're trying to say Uber drivers have all this flexibility, and there's a certain degree of truth to that if you only need to do it part-time. But I've interviewed a lot of drivers for this book, and what you see is that those drivers who drive it the least and have been driving it the shortest are the happiest. The ones who have been doing it for a while and have been, there for a year. In fact, Uber's own numbers show half the Uber drivers don't last for a year. They leave the platform because after you've gone through a few of Travis Kalanick's pay cuts, which come on a regular basis, after a while you think I'm not making as much money as I did when I started, so you move on. So there's just a lot of factors like that, I think that.
I was really interested in identifying the role of the technology in this, because we've had bad jobs in the economy for a very long time, and especially over the last couple of decades. We've developed in the retail sector an enormous amount of bad jobs, like the Starbucks employee who gets a shift till 11 one night, and then the shift the next day starts at 4 a.m. in the morning, and he barely has time to get home and come back to work. So. And I've seen some pushback against the notion that the gig economy is causing a significant part of this bad work, and some stats have been deployed in this. So, for instance, the number of part-time workers have not really gone up over the long term. The number of workers that are self-employed has actually declined somewhat, according to government statistics, over the last decade or so. So there's a little bit of a pushback in the sense, well, is the gig economy really that big a part of this deterioration of work? And then there's the other thing, that some of the jobs that the gig economy is replacing aren't like the great jobs that we think that are going to support our middle class. So like a taxi driver in New York is not a great job. So Uber might be not an ideal job, but the job that it's hitting isn't an ideal job either. And so in fact, Alan Krueger, former economic advisor of President Obama, actually did this work for Uber that I'm sure you must be aware with.
I comment on the Krueger report I was not impressed with that report, but
his conclusion was that Uber drivers actually made more than hired drivers, right? That they were making like $19 an hour on average versus about $13 for a cabbie that was hired by a cab company. And so, that suggests that, it's certainly not a fantastic job, but I wonder if this is a real sign of an unraveling of sort of like the labor contract and the labor market.
Sure. Real quickly on the Krueger report, I was surprised that he put his name on that, because he is, a respected economist. There were a few things wrong with that report. One, it relied exclusively on Uber's data. And, this is a company that plays fast and loose with the facts. I like to say that you can trust Uber's data about as much as you can trust China's or Greece's data. But secondly, when he came up with how much they get paid, they didn't take into account how much drivers spend, how much their expenses are to drive, which are significant. You know, you've got gas, you've got tolls, you've got, you know, just everything it takes to drive a car through New York City, and, you know, insurance and all these sorts of things, and they didn't take into account that at all. And, you know, some of the estimates said $7,000 to $10,000 a year in driving expenses. The other thing that was problematic about that report is they gathered the data for that report in October of 2014. They released the data in January 2015, timed to impress the mayors at the Conference of Mayors. And a week later, after that conference, they cut all the Uber's wages, drivers' wages by 40%. So the data itself was completely out of date at that point. And yet you still see people citing the Kruger report as somehow authoritative. And I just think that it really doesn't capture. There have been journalists who have gone around and ridden with Uber drivers and gotten pay stubs and all these sorts of things. And just a lot of anecdotal evidence out there. Drivers are saying, we're barely making minimum wage here. They're not making any more than taxi drivers. Maybe some are if they're really good. I don't know what you have to do to be good, but clearly not everybody has that ability. And some drivers are just really struggling being Uber drivers. That's why they last so long. I mean, 50% of the drivers drive 15 hours or less. If it really paid that much more, they'd be driving on that platform a lot more than they are. 80% of Uber drivers, according to Uber's numbers, are part-time workers. So then in terms of the data, how big is this gig economy? Yes, there's definitely, there's a lot of gray area in there. And you know, the US government first did a study back in 2005, and since then has quit gathering data on it. And so I feel like the way we're counting this is not capturing what's really going on out there in the labor force. I'll just give you one simple example. You know, the unemployment rate is coming down. Well, in traditional economic theory, when the unemployment rate comes down, then the employment rate is supposed to go up. They're inversely related, like a seesaw. And yet, we're living in a time where as the unemployment rate is coming down, the employment rate has also been coming down, and now it's sort of holding steady, but it hasn't gotten back to where it was before the Great Recession in 2008. And so, where are all these workers going? I mean, they have to make money, they have to live. Well, you know, they're becoming discouraged workers, as they're called. They're going into the gray economy. I mean, even Janet Yellen, in testimony before the Senate Banking Committee, testified that, you know, they're not confident that they're accurately counting these sorts of workers. And so, you know, the statistics that are put out there by the BLS, they use things like household surveys, job surveys of employers, and so it depends on people reporting a certain viewpoint. And there's a sense that maybe they're not reporting accurately, because we do see things like 1099 forms, which is the form that a contractor files with the IRS. Those have gone way up by 20%. The number of people filing Schedule C, which is the schedule you use with the IRS if you're doing self-employment, those are up by 20%. So we'll have to see how it plays out over time. My sense is, you know, it might be more hitting certain areas than others. So San Francisco, New York City, it's probably hitting these areas a lot more than it is maybe, you know, in mid parts of the country. But in San Francisco, my sense is that it's up quite a deal. You know, and it's really impacting the labor force in major ways. And you add in things like robots and automation and all these sorts of things, and, you know, some of the statistics we've seen on that Oxford University study saying 47% of U.S. jobs are replaceable over the next 20 years. People have disputed that number. But still, I mean, you can't just, you know, I mean, the response to that is, well, we've always had technological change. New jobs come along. But what other experts are saying, not this time, that the ability of these algorithms and the technology to take a job and cut it down into little bites and hand big parts of that job off to different parts of technology, and the human's job is left to just hit the button. And how much are they going to pay you to hit that button? And they can just hire anybody to do it as a contractor. They don't need to, you know, to hire a regular W-2, because the thing that for people don't know, the difference between, for an employer's perspective, if you hire a contractor versus a regularly employed W-2 worker, you get out of paying about 30% on labor costs, because you don't have to pay for Social Security, Medicare, health care, injured worker compensation, unemployment compensation, you know, or let alone any paid sick leave, paid, you know, vacation or anything. You get out of all of that, and that's part of the incentive of doing that. And we've seen it in the book. I have an example of the pharmaceutical company Merck. They had a plant in Philadelphia. They sell the plant to another company. The company lays off all 400 workers, hires back all 400 workers, and then they proceed to make the same drugs for Merck that Merck was making for itself when it had these employers. So I mean, this is the real scare that I have, is that what the gig economy, it's not a matter of how big it is. It's the technology it's pioneering. These apps make it so much easier to hire and fire people. You know, if I'm an employer and you're an employer, and you're an employer and you're an employer, and I can hire all 1099 workers, you know, contractors and freelancers, and you do the same and you do the same, it's going to put pressure on you to do the same. And it becomes a race to the bottom at that point. It's what I call the steroids of the economy. You can't not do it because everyone else is doing it. If you want to compete, you've got to do the steroids too.
Yeah, no, at the end of the day, the underlying story is, what is technology going to do to the labor relation to work? And I mean, for instance, from the taxi driver's perspective, I think that a future in where there's lots of Uber drivers is not as bad as a future in where every car is a Google car and there are no drivers at all, and some company called Google just rents out time in their cars and go pick you up. And that's, you know, it seems to be within technology's possibilities. But so yeah, the job constrained future, which is a term that you use in the book, is to me the central theme here. And as you alluded to right now, this is a fear that we've had for a very, very long time. I mean, we've had it at least since the Industrial Revolution, and it's always been, to date, proven wrong. And you're suggesting that right now there's evidence to suggest that this time might indeed be different. And yet, again, to push back a little bit, if you look at labor productivity stats, if technology were really increasing a lot, you'd probably be seeing labor productivity increasing pretty robustly, because there would be all these machines that, so each worker, you'd be getting more profit out of each particular worker. And in fact, that's not happening. We're seeing the contrary. So that leads me to a little bit of, again, a little bit of skepticism. Is really technology having that big bite that we fear so much?
It's a healthy skepticism. I think that, again, we're not sure where we are on this wheel yet. Labor productivity is notoriously hard to measure. There's all sorts of controversy over, even before this, about whether we were really measuring it accurately. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows at this point whether this is going to all flame out and we'll just be left with, the same old economy we have, which for the last 25 years, wages have been flat. Or if, this automation and robots and gig economy and, they're already using technology for things like just-in-time scheduling, where they can now know exactly when their customers are going to be there. And so they tell their employees, I only need you, 2 days from now, and I can't tell you your schedule 2 weeks from now. You just have to be on call, basically. You have no life. You need to be ready to come in at a moment's notice. You can't plan childcare. You can't. The technology is already being used in some ways that I think are degrading the quality of jobs. Whether it will ever reach the level of, which I fear it could, we'll have to see. I think we don't want to ignore the possibilities, though, and because there are things going on I think are alarming.
Yeah, no, indeed not. I think that we have to be aware of what's happening and try to make sense of it. And, but again, we can also allow ourselves to go in a wrong direction and misidentify the problem. I was having a conversation with Paul Romer, an economist at NYU, a little while ago, who's done a lot of work on tech, on how technology affects growth over the long term. And he was suggesting to me that when the people 100 years from now look back at our present moment, they're going to see this debate over technology and whether it replaces jobs instead of complementing jobs as it has in the past as very much of a sideshow. And people say, well, why didn't people think, well, actually what happened was China happened. Suddenly we got the entire Chinese population dumped on the world labor market, and that had an enormous impact on the wages and the quality of jobs across the world, notably in the United States. And that seems to have been, in our current fear of technology, that seems to have taken a back seat. And I wonder, I wonder what drives this, because I was a young journalist when NAFTA was being negotiated. And I remember that at the time there was a lot of fear about how, negotiating this trade deal with Mexico would hurt American jobs because there would be all these low-wage workers competing for the jobs that American workers do. And at the time you'd hear all these economists, like saying, no, you know what, trade doesn't really do that bad. Trade is ultimately a win-win proposition. What we're seeing, what kind of like the negative effects that we see in the labor market are more driven by technology. And sort of like maybe I think that we were set down that road and we lost sight of some of the other really big dynamics that are going on. And to be sure, I mean, the China and globalization story has a technological component, right? There's a lot of technology in the outsourcing of labor production chains throughout the world. But still, I mean, I think that is really perhaps a bigger part of the story than it might seem, from reading your book and from reading some of the other commentaries about technology.
Well, I do talk in the book about globalization, its impact, but it's not, there's so many other books that have tackled that I don't think it negates at all what we're talking about, what I talk about in the book. It's all part of the picture. There is a reason why for the last 25, 30 years, wages have been flat in the United States, and many of the jobs have lost safety nets and all these sorts of things. It is partly due to technology, but it's also due to jobs being exported. To me, there's no contradiction there or zero-sum game. There are many pressures on the economy that are going to create these sorts of disequilibriums that we have to cope with. I think part of the issue is that we're not coping with them well. If you look at the types of workers who are, the typical worker used to have one employer, and that employer they worked for many years, and that's who they got their kind of New Deal benefits through. Well, for more and more employees, there's no question that they're working for more and more multiple employers now, and each one of them, maybe they're working part-time as a hairdresser, and maybe they're driving some hours a week for Lyft, and maybe they're doing some other hours on TaskRabbit. So for a lot of workers today, these are the sorts of realities that they're having to deal with, and they're not concerned about whether they're being counted in the statistics or not. They're just wondering, how do I get what I need? And so, the safety net, for example, was not set up for this type of worker or for this type of economy. It was set up for the single employer type of situation. So, regardless of how the numbers ultimately work out, I think we have to still look at how to create a safety net for workers who are working for multiple employers. We have to look for ways that to make sure that people can afford things like health care and have enough to do that. And and a lot of the employers now are doing everything they can to wiggle out of their responsibilities in that way. So.
My particular bias is I share your fear. I came to this part where you talk of a robo-reporter, so now there's robots doing the job that I do, and right now they're just mostly doing like sports scores and market reports, but if they can do that, why not columns, right? You can just push a button for Rise Skepticism and they get the Rise Skeptical column and I'm out of a job. So, and so perhaps this is a good moment to try to think about solutions. How do you think, what are the policy implications of this and how do we address this? You just mentioned now and you talk at length in the book about the idea of taking the safety net, disconnecting it from the individual employer so that workers can take it throughout their movement through all these different gigs. I wonder, does that cut it?
Well, I think we have to do something to retain the safety net, but it won't. That's not going to increase wages. So there's a lot of challenges there. But in a multi-employer world, I think we have to create some sort of what you can call portable benefits, where you could take them from job to job and not. A lot of workers say are stuck in job lock. Say, well, I'd like to leave this job, but I have a pension here, and if I leave, I'm going to lose my pension, or I'm going to lose my health care, and so they stay there. Well, if we could create a system where they can take those with them no matter where they go, then it would actually liberate to some degree the creativity of many workers who get stuck. And actually in the book, what I draw from is that there actually are, if you look at construction and mining and other sorts of industries, construction and trade industries, a carpenter, for example, it's been this way for many years, where they might have multiple employers throughout the year. They might work 2 months for one employer, and then 3 weeks for another, and then 4 months for another. And so over the course of a year, they might work for 6, 7 employers. And what they have a system set up for them, an hours bank system, where each employer would pay a certain amount into an account for that carpenter, based on prorated to the number of hours that that carpenter works for that employer. And then that money in that account could be used to pay for things like Social Security, Medicare, injured worker, unemployment, health care, all these sorts of things. Now, it worked beautifully in many instances in those occupations because they were part of a union. And the union would, they set up a trust, and the union representatives and the employer representatives all sit on that trust board, and they negotiate a contract that all those carpenters are work under for those employers. And so, you know, we're obviously organized labor at this point is down to about 7% of workers are organized in the private sector, and it doesn't seem to be, it's not going to go up anytime soon. So we can't really have, just have it for union workers. So I was thinking, well, how can we do this for workers in general? And so what I'm proposing is that we create for every worker what I call an individual security account. And that, be attached to their Social Security number or something like this. And that worker, the employer who that worker works for will pay into this account prorated to the number of hours that that worker works for that employer. So if Uber wants to hire a driver, they can still hire a contractor. They can hire and fire them at will. But they aren't going to get out of the responsibility of paying a certain amount into this individual security account for that worker. And I've done some of the statistical crunching using Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers. Especially for low-wage workers, it works out to about $2 an hour above their wage. That's not a lot of money to give them, to help them pay into Social Security, Medicare, injured worker, unemployment, health care. That would include 5 days of paid sick leave and 5 days of paid vacation. It's not a lot of money. And so, workers can then work for multiple employers, and each employer would pay their fair share. And basically, it's creating legal parity between all these different categories of workers. Because right now, a lot of employers are in this thing like, is this a contractor or worker? Will I get sued? Uber's being sued. 2 class action lawsuits right now saying your drivers are actually your employers, not contractors. And these lawsuits are tremendously expensive, take years to work through the courts. By the time you actually win, they've changed, they found other loopholes. It's just, you just never quite win in these sorts of lawsuits. So this sort of proposal gets past all that. Doesn't matter what the category of worker is when it comes to this safety net. Every worker would get it. Every employer would pay into it. And it's basically an insurance. It's like Social Security. It's an insurance. And the biggest insurance pool, you always want to have an insurance plan passed on to the biggest insurance pool. And the insurance pool here would be consumers. So those businesses would be able to pass a certain amount of that cost on to those consumers. But those consumers will also be, many of them, the ones who are benefiting, because they're getting a safety net. So in this sense, a rising tide would float all boats with this sort of proposal. And this idea is being talked about more and more. Senator Mark Warner has talked about it. And some other people have picked up on this idea since I put a paper out in the spring that other people started passing around.
An alternative, of course, would be to have a richer Social Security and perhaps a more generous universal health insurance scheme, as in many European social democracies, right? And so people wouldn't rely so much on their employer for a lot of their.
This is what a lot of European social democracies do, though. Like in Europe, part-timers and freelancers and temps, there are certain things you can't treat them that much differently from regularly employed workers as you can here in the U.S. That's what I mean. It creates legal parity between all these different classification of workers. So in some ways, it is kind of adopting some of that model and making a U.S. Brand of it, if you will. Though I would agree with you. I mean, actually, I have a book coming out in May called Expand Social Security Now, and I'm proposing that we double the Social Security payout and also how to pay for it using, creating more fairness in the tax code. So I think that's got to be, these are the sorts of things I think, seriously, we're going to have to look at in a much more rigorous and serious way than we have in the past, beyond just people writing op-eds about this sort of thing. I mean, Elizabeth Warren's going to have to find a lot more supporters for her idea, and Bernie Sanders too.
Well, you know, because in fact, the portability thing, the move of defined benefit pensions to 401ks was supposed to solve the portability issue, right? And it just basically dumped a lot of risk onto the laps of workers who really weren't able to deal with it, right? And so, you know, you really need a much more carefully crafted.
Yeah, not only risk, but it turned out the 401k system was a complete failure, because if wages are flat for 25 years, no one's saving enough money to put it in the 401k. And you know, the 401k is a federal subsidy. It's actually called in the federal codes an expenditure, because it is an expense that the government incurs. And yet 80% of the benefits from that accrues to the 20% highest income earners. So that's what's happened to our 401k system, where it's just going. I mean, same with, you know, to be honest, the home mortgage interest deduction is, you know, most of that, 75, 80% of that accrues to top income earners. So all these things they put into place that was supposed to be incentives and vehicles to help all of us save have not worked. They have completely, in my view, failed. And we have to, you know, at this point, you've got a lot of industries that are special interests who are wedded into that system. But we do have to look at how to unravel it and coming up with something more like an expanded Social Security, because it would be much more efficient. Social Security is popular. Even 70% of Republicans say they like Social Security. So why not build on what works instead of continually trying to, you know, tweak what's failing?
Yeah, over the past year, I've been talking to a bunch of these, you know, Silicon Valley moguls that are, you know, talking about this wonderful future that's coming to us. And a lot of them do kind of agree that there is going to be a problem in the labor market. The technology will disrupt the jobs, and that something must be done. That maybe, we need to change the social safety net or something, because the job market's not going to do the job that it has done over the last, you know, half century or more. And but it seems that their near universal solution is something that I think that you don't really like very much, which is the universal basic income. And I've heard this from a bunch of people. Oh, right, you know, maybe jobs will, you know, there will be no high quality jobs anymore, but we'll have a universal basic income. And people will be able to relax, whatever, follow their hobbies, travel, I don't know. And we will still manage to maintain a kind of like.
It sounds like the old Soviet system. We pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. Or you know, the bread and circuses in Rome, in, you know, Imperial Rome, where they gave people some basic food, and then they go to the Colosseum and watch gladiators hack each other apart, and maybe that's where we're headed. I don't know. I mean, it's you know, it wouldn't be the first time. I mean, if you look through human history, humans have done horrible things to each other and come up with some really truly terrible systems of governance that haven't worked very well. Maybe that's where we're headed. I mean, imagine. You know, I can see the movie now, Imperial Rome, but with our technology, right? And there's a movie that, you know, you want to go to that movie and see it, but you want to be able to walk out of it at the end, right? Imagine if you were living in it and couldn't walk out. Yeah.
And yet, I mean, if whatever social safety net we have is tied to jobs still in some way or form, and the quality of jobs is deteriorating and the pay is deteriorating for a large share of the workforce, it seems to me that the social safety net alone is not the answer, that you need to address through policy like the market distribution of income. And I wonder, you know, and there are ideas out there. Tony Atkinson, which you referred to before, has put out a whole book about how to deal with this at the market level, and he's proposed things like, you know, profit sharing, which you also seem to support, although in a slightly different way. He says, well, through higher estate taxes, we can just include a capital endowment for every adult. He proposes government jobs at a guaranteed minimum wage, so that every worker has a minimum number of hours working at a minimum wage. And you could take this further. You could change intellectual property rights to reduce rents of so many firms. You could tighten anti-monopoly laws. So I wonder, what role do you think is beyond the safety net? What changes would you call for?
Well, you know, there's a few ways to go about it. I mean, everybody needs to have a certain things in order to live. And you can try to give them more income, more wages to buy those things, which has always been the U.S. approach. But in other parts of the world, instead what they've done is tried to take some of the wealth being produced by that society and create these different pools of social insurance and use that to design more cost-efficient systems like healthcare so that the cost to people is less. You know, I mean, if your costs are less, then you don't need as much income. And so that's why, you know, if you look at healthcare in the United States compared to France or Belgium or, you know, for my previous book, Europe's Promise, I went all over Europe and talked to a lot of Americans who were living there and had lived for, you know, a couple of decades and lived in quite a few different countries and asked them, who has the best healthcare system? And, you know, the answers I usually got were, for the most part, France and Belgium seem to have the best. Switzerland is also quite good. Germany is, you know, also good. And, you know, what they do is they design the system in a way that they can build in certain efficiencies to that system. Whereas here we have this very ad hoc, decentralized system, overlapping layers of bureaucracy. And so we're paying twice as much money per capita for healthcare for only covering like 85% of our population. And they're paying, you know, about half the amount for covering 100% of their population. So you can design systems, healthcare, childcare, education systems in a way that is more efficient, more cost effective. And so I think that we still have a ways to go in order to do that sort of thing. So that's, you know, one approach that I think you can do. You know, in terms of wages, the other thing that I propose in the book, I mean, you know, I'm just not going to sit around waiting for them to give us some sort of guaranteed wage. I just can't believe it's going to happen. I just see nothing in our history to convince me that that's going to take place. I think instead what we need to do is pass laws and legislation and regulations around these companies like what they have in Germany, which I propose in the book. You know, for example, Germany has Fortune 500 companies like we do, big corporations with names you've heard of, you know, Siemens and Mercedes and Volkswagen. Volkswagen gets a chuckle now. But these companies are, you know, these are profitable companies. In Germany, by law, the workers get to elect 50% of the members of the boards of directors of these companies. I mean, how many people here have heard of that? It's called co-determination. Just a few hands. Now, isn't that amazing? This is what Germany is doing, you know, like the world's largest exporter of goods. And most of us have not even heard of this. We just think, oh, German corporations are like ours. They actually aren't. Germans have reinvented the corporation, in essence, and we don't even know about it. Sweden also does this. Quite a few countries in Europe have some version of this. It would be as if, you know, Walmart, if the workers of Walmart got to elect 50% of the members of the boards of directors, right? We chuckle at that and we smile at that. We can't even imagine that. And yet that's what it would be. So I think there's a lot of things we could do. We don't just have to wait for them to decide to give us a guaranteed basic or living wage. We can actually create systems there. I mean, we don't have to create them. We just have to copy what's already been done because many other countries are already doing this. When you look at a lot of these measurements, the charts, you know, the line graphs, the U.S. is like usually the outlier up here in the upper right of all these charts and graphs and such things on so many of these things. And so, you know, we just need to be more open to what other places are doing and start coming up with U.S. versions of it. I mean, one of the things I propose in the book is why not do this at the university level? Universities aren't necessarily, we don't think of them as businesses that are going to fight this kind of thing. So universities could put in place co-determination where the workers get to elect 50% of the members of the board of directors. Get it in place somewhere here that we can point to and say it's working here. And then from there you start spreading it to businesses. You know, so we can do this in blue states because, you know, red states, right-to-work states certainly aren't going to do this. But in California, we could do this. In New York, it's almost a blue state. The legislature goes back and forth between Republican and Democratic control. But so I mean, there's things we can do. We don't have to just wait for the robots to come and take our jobs. In other words.
Yeah, I mean, and yet I think that the odds that the United States somehow becomes a European social democracy are, you know, very, very, very long. You know, a point that I would make is that even as much as I like European social democracies, they're pretty much in trouble too. So just to note. Germany, again, Germany has passed labor reform over the last decade or so that has really reduced the quality of jobs. They've introduced this concept called the mini job, which really has no sorts of, has really no protections, pretty much like an American type of job. And most of the growth in employment in Germany has come from such mini jobs. So the stresses that we are seeing here are very similar to stresses that are being experienced in Europe. And even though they do have better policies to start off with, I feel that they too, that in Europe too, they're feeling the same sort of push in the same sort of direction as we are. So, I don't see it as a really, a fail-safe, line of defense.
Well, I mean, they're subject to globalization. So, if it's going to be a race to the bottom, then countries like us are pulling them down. So we have to, I mean, even the mini jobs, though, in Germany, those workers have more rights than what contractors or freelancers have here. They still have access to health care. They still have access to, certain labor rights. Those rights can't be taken away for workers in these sorts of jobs. So, I mean, yes, they are feeling that pressure too, but it's a difference of degree, a major difference of degree in terms of how much they're going down that road compared to how much we are. And so, I think we have to be careful not to just say, well, it's happening there too, so I guess there's nothing we can learn there. I mean, so much of what we're hearing about Europe these days has to do with Greece. And that has nothing to do with the types of issues we're talking about. That has to do with how, I mean, the European Union and European member states are going through a decades-long process of how united they want to be as a continent. How much federalism do they want to have? And a thing I like to remind both Europeans and Americans is that we went through a similar process in 1790. We tend to forget that 70 years after our nation's founding, we fought a civil war. And it wasn't over slavery. That's what it has passed down in a lot of the books. It was over states' rights. And slavery was just a subset of that. We fought a battle over how much central government should dominate over states' rights and state government. And that was 70 years later. So I sometimes like to say Europe it's kind of like a planet in formation. It's going to take decades to play that out. We're used to things changing in our lives on the order of days and weeks and months. Countries and continents, they change on the order of decades. And that's what's going on in Europe right now. And in some ways it's kind of exciting, but in the short term, it leads to some hair-raising headlines for sure.
I hope they can prevent a civil war.
Yeah, exactly.
So just to end this, I think the question that jumps to mind to me is to understand the political economy of these changes that you've identified as necessary. I wrote a column, I don't know, a couple of years ago saying, well, we got the New Deal out of the Great Depression. What does a Great Recession deliver to us? Can we turn this crisis into an opportunity? Will this, generate this type of social policies and change in the social contract that might lead us perhaps in the direction that you suggest? And I think that the answer to that is, well, no, it has not. It did not. And I'm not sure if it's, Ben Bernanke's fault that he, prevented a total collapse of the economy and hence we didn't really get radical policies.
It's to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah, exactly. Or what? But so then what is the necessary, what kind of a jolt to the system, what are the necessary ingredients for these kinds of political changes to happen?
Here's my response. I mean, we have a lot of work to do. And the federal level is dead. I mean, nothing's going to happen at the federal level for many years, I don't think. My previous books were written on politics and political reform and looking at our political structures. And, the reality is that Republicans aren't interested in any of this. And the Democrats, besides, even when they get majorities, seem to fumble the ball a lot. But it's going to be increasingly hard for them to get majorities because the demographics of partisan demographics of the districts and what have you, not due to redistricting abuses, though that is a minor factor. It just has to do with where people live. I live in San Francisco, and it's not possible for a Republican to win in San Francisco. There's too many Democrats. And it's not possible for Democrats to win in other parts of the country because there's too many Republicans. And it turns out most of the districts are like this. Out of 435 districts, we can tell you who's going to win 90% of them right now in 2016. We can not only tell you who's going to win, we can tell you the margin of victory because it's so predictable based on the partisan demographics of those districts. And here's the thing, the Democrats have become such an urban-based party that it's much harder to draw districts for them, even if you do a gerrymander or, you know, what have you, because they're just too concentrated. I mean, in San Francisco, Nancy Pelosi wins with 80% of the vote. And people say, well, she won in a landslide. No, she actually wasted, you know, 29% of the vote that could have been given to other districts, so let Democrats win other districts. So even though Obama beat Mitt Romney by, what, 5 percentage points, Mitt Romney won about 20 more congressional districts nationwide. So that's what the Democrats are facing, the uphill battle. So federal level, forget it. The battle is going to be at the local and state level. That's where it has to happen. And right here in New York City, you can pass a safety net, a multi-employer safety net for every worker in the city at the city council level. It doesn't require federal law to do that. You know, you can do some of this at the state level. There's a lot of things. You can pass co-determination at the state level. You can pass some of these other reforms that are in my book at the state level or at the local level. You know, we have to roll up our sleeves and get to work because, I mean, you know, we can't completely ignore the federal level because if the wrong people get in there, they can do a lot of damage and set things back even further. But I'm suggesting that local and state level is where people have to get working. You know, you've all heard of the ALEC database, right? It's the I forget what it stands for. It's the far right's legal arm where they draft legislation, and they have it ready for state legislators who come and say, I need a law on this, and it's all ready to go. I mean, it's been going for years, and the left never had anything like this. Well, it now does. There's an organization called SIX, S-I-X, and so you should check out their website. They're putting legislation on there for progressive legislators. They're bringing progressive legislators together into meetings like ALEC has been doing for years in order to, you know, help them start meeting each other. You know, I mean, it's just organized, right? We can do that. We know how to do that. So.
On that optimistic note, we're right on schedule. So I'm going to open it up now. Questions. We have 15 minutes, so we've got to be efficient about this. Please, if you want to make a comment, do so in a reasonably length sentence, and not a paragraph or a page. And a question, there should be one question, again, reasonably length. So, floor is open. Sure.
Thank you. Great presentation. And I'm going to be a little longer than one sentence, but I'll be quick. I was listening to the news, you know, about Airbnb and their political controversy over the ads in San Francisco. And it struck me that what they're looking at is getting people to commoditize their assets. And they're really looking for everyone to be an entrepreneur, in quotes, in this economy, right? And you talk about that they're not giving pensions, but what exists are SEP IRAs, you know, Keogh plans. Those are all set up, but I don't see people having the sophistication to do that, to work in that manner. And so I'm just curious, you didn't discuss it today, but I was wondering, have you thought about it and agree with that? Or, you know, why do you see that that's not, I don't think it'll work. It's almost like going back to the agricultural societies we had where everyone used their assets, whatever they had.
In the book, I do talk about this a little bit. You know, there's this, because a lot of these sharing economy companies now are starting to go through the white dwarf stage into the black hole stage of basically going belly up. Because their whole model was predicated on this idea that we all can be our own CEOs. We all can be our own entrepreneurs, you know, and I'm going to set up a business where you can connect to a customer and you'll be able to sell yourself and, you know, go out there and be your own business. And it turns out that, you know, for a lot of people, that's not really what they're cut out to be. Not everybody can hustle like that. I mean, maybe we all should be able to. Maybe they'll come up with a drug someday that makes us all hyperactive, and we'll all be able to. But it doesn't exist right now. And so, but the funny thing about it is this one former CEO of the dead company was basically saying, like, it turns out, we overestimated. We thought everybody we hired would be like me, a self-starter who wants to start a new business, a new company, and it turns out they're not. Who would have thunk it? You know, and so somehow, you know, the whole basis of their model was founded on a lot of assumptions about human nature and people, and they turned out to not be true. That's why even like TaskRabbit, which was hailed by all sorts of media, all those stories about TaskRabbit, this is how we're going to work in the future. TaskRabbit now has done what's in Silicon Valley is called a pivot. Means their business model is failing. Their venture capitalists are saying, we're not sure we want to give you more money. And so they basically have become a glorified temp agency, just using apps and websites more than other temp agencies do. And you're seeing this in a lot of these labor brokerage websites. Uber and Airbnb have the two that have sort of kept going. But even there's a great deal of smoke and mirrors involved. You don't know how much money these companies are really making because they're not public companies. And again, the only numbers come from them. And so they have, in Silicon Valley, it all lives on smoke and mirrors. People keep giving you money as long as they think it's getting better and better and they're going to make more and more. As soon as they start thinking the other way, poof, it all disappears. So they have to keep the charade going as long as they can. I have a question. I had an op-ed in the New York Daily News yesterday on Airbnb. This will be a test to see how many people read the New York Daily. Did anybody see it? Darn. God, you don't know how much I went through. I don't know how much work it took to get that in that paper. And anyway, it was on Airbnb. I mean, just so in case we don't get to, here's the quick thing on Airbnb. Started out as a good idea. Let people rent out their spare homes, their spare rooms, and make some extra money in a down economy. It's a great idea in certain ways. It's morphed into something completely different. It's morphed into a loophole for professional landlords and property managers and real estate operatives to basically circumvent the law. Because all the cities that they passed laws a long time ago saying you can't rent for fewer than 30 days. The reason why is they didn't want their housing stock to be pitted tourists versus local residents. The housing needs of tourists are different from local residents. And if you let these short-term rentals, too many of them happen, then suddenly your housing stock gets used up by tourists. Well, so that prevailed for many years. And then Craigslist came along, started doing it a little bit. It was still okay. It was at acceptable numbers. Suddenly Airbnb comes along and just busts the whole thing wide open. So that now you have so many people on there who are renting out. I've interviewed tenant after tenant in San Francisco who was evicted from their place by a landlord who just wanted to get them out of their rent-controlled apartment so that they could put it on Airbnb. And the landlords are just doing unconscionable things. And they seem to target elderly people, disabled people, people who have language minority challenges, people who have a harder time defending themselves and aren't going to necessarily go out and hire a lawyer to defend themselves. They're just, what's going on in San Francisco is just really horrible. And it's going on here in New York, too, in a lot of ways. Where these professionals are just taking over the platform. And Airbnb knows it because they have the numbers. And there are people who scrape their website and get these numbers. You can see how many hosts have multiple properties. That's how you know what's going on. And it's just taking over the website, and Airbnb is making money hand over fist, so they're not about to kill their golden goose. And they're still putting forward in San Francisco, they're voting this November 3rd on Proposition F, a citizens initiative, to crack down on Airbnb. They're putting forward the, quote, regular people as the face of Airbnb in their campaign, and that's not who it is anymore. It's these professionals who are taking it over. Sorry to go on there.
I have one kind of short question. Let me, one impression that I have actually from today's talk and generally, one problem that I also had, there seems to be like two narratives. One is robotics are taking over all the jobs and basically we would have no jobs and nothing to do, leisure. So it is one narrative. But the second narrative is that actually work is really impeding or actually taking more and more of our normally leisure time and free time. So one narrative seems that actually we really should fear loss of job and loss of work. The other narrative is that we are not going to have leisure time anymore. So which narrative is really true?
I think they're both true. They're not inconsistent because one is the loss of jobs is going to happen over time. That's what sort of the experts are saying. It's going to happen over 10, 15, 20 years. It already has happened to some degree. And in my book, I have an example of at University of California, San Francisco, big hospital medical center. They have now a big robot that can fill prescriptions. They can do like 10,000 a day. They're just basically making pharmacists obsolete. And what the pharmacist is going to do in the future, I don't know. But these robots can take the pills out of a bin. They've got they know who it's going to, and they slap a barcode on the plastic bag with the prescription, and it goes up a chute and goes to the patient. So I mean, this is the type of thing that we're being told is going to happen more and more, but it's going to happen over time. In the meantime, in the here and now, people are working harder and longer for less. And I think maybe, if we extrapolate 20, 30 years from now, if the doomsday scenario comes true, you can imagine that there may be a lot of jobs for people still to do, but they'll be very menial jobs, and they'll pay, next to nothing. And, I mean, if you want to really go with the science fiction scenario, the overlords will live in the upper buildings of upper floors of these buildings. They'll have their land bridges. It'll be like there's this species of salamander in the top of redwood trees that never steps on the floor, that just lives at the top of the trees. They'll just live at the tops of the buildings, and the rest of us will be down here toiling at whatever jobs are left.
Let me extend Stephen's answer. That those pharmacists will end up monetizing all their time doing odd jobs, which you're in a good position to tell us what they're going to be doing.
If I could add to the answer, I mean, we already see it today, right? It's not like suddenly all the jobs are taken out and so that there's no job that pays above zero, but you see it hitting in the wage. And so essentially to acquire a certain amount of income, you just need to work more, right? So you see this in the shift jobs in the retail sector right now, and this is just kind of an acceleration. What he proposes is an acceleration of this process.
Yeah, and I mean, Uber, Travis Kalanick, the CEO of Uber, when people complain about, their wages being cut, he says, well, because our prices will be lower, there'll be more people with fares, and you can just drive, you'll have more fares per hour. And, the driver's like, well, so I'm just supposed to drive faster? And I mean, it's just speed up, but it's not in a factory. But, I mean, I think this is emblematic of how this sort of Silicon Valley mentality is and the type of reality they're expecting us to cope with.
Yes? Just one second.
Some of the suggestions you were making about changes at the state and local level sounded very optimistic. Could you talk a little bit about the political implications? Because we had a little incident here where the mayor wanted to just put a temporary hold on growth for Uber so we could study it and see what it does to labor, to traffic, to all kinds of things, and boy, did he get beaten down.
Well, you don't win every battle. I think the position the mayor took was correct. I certainly see it in San Francisco. Driving through downtown San Francisco is way more difficult. It takes you a lot more time. There's so much more congestion. Now, some of it may be that the economy has picked up some. But, the economy, I've lived there for many years. The economy was good before it was bad, and the traffic wasn't like this. There are so many more Uber and Lyft drivers and ride sharing and sidecar and all of them, and so, I think that if you go after that and you try to somehow rein it in, then if you lose the battle, you have to try it again. I mean, it sounds like they had to regroup. They were not prepared for the storm that came in their direction. But here's the other thing that I would like to emphasize. I mean, there's something about some of these platforms has some positive aspects to it. The Uber technology could be used in a positive way. In fact, in Finland, they're taking that Uber technology and putting it into their public buses. And they are, it's like smaller shuttles. And you get on that shuttle, and you tell the driver where you want to go. And the driver plots a route for all the passengers in real time. And they don't follow a set route all the time. They can drop you door to door. So there are some things that can be done with this technology if we think of our streets as a public utility. That's the key. Our streets are a public utility. They're not for Travis Kalanick to just flood the street with cars so that he can make more and more money. I mean, the medallion system comes from the Great Depression, when cities like New York, suddenly people got in their cars to make money because they didn't have jobs. And it was just completely chaos. Not only too many cars on the road, but, rogue drivers doing horrible things to passengers, all sorts of things. That's where the medallion system came from. Well, I think we're going to be going back to something like that, where there's just going to be so many cars on the road. It's a clash of conveniences. Sure, it's a convenience to hit your app and have the Uber show up in 5 minutes. But then if you get in that car and you're sitting in traffic for another 35 extra minutes, then you haven't gained very much, have you? Because there's just too much congestion going on. Not to mention the more carbon is being belched, more pollution. We have to really think about what we're going to do. And the other thing that Uber could certainly end up doing, because now they're talking about trying to create their own little carpools. But think about this. The way public transportation works is you have certain lines that are profitable because they're used all the time. And then you have other lines that aren't profitable because they're not used as much. And yet if you're going to have a comprehensive grid of public transportation, you need all of those lines. Well, if Uber and these other services start having a service that just sprints up and down the profitable lines and cherry-picking passengers, it will completely undermine the funding for public transportation. So, we really have to think about these things and design them more carefully rather than just saying, Travis Kalanick, sure, flood our street with cars. I love getting, Americans are having this great big fantasy that we can all have our own private limo that shows up to pick us up for 5 minutes after you hit the app. And I'm sorry, you just can't do that and not expect that there's going to be some real downsides to what's going to happen by flooding your streets with cars.
One more question.
Thank you tonight. All the commentary and the questions have been very illuminating. I've been studying contingent work since the late 1980s and the transition in American employment relations. In fact, I worked at this university in a blue state in a union without a contract for 6 years. Just thought I'd add that. I've mostly looked at the adjunctification of higher education and its associated demise with American education. And I think these are important things to consider as we're talking about this Uberization. This has happened to the university. It's been happening since 1973. Now here's my question. At the end of your talk, you mentioned, just get out there and do it. We can't do it federally, we'll have to do it locally. Well, what's to prevent, the elephant in the room, which is Citizens United, from exerting forces in our own state? So we do great things in New York, Connecticut, wherever, Massachusetts, and those firms, those companies just move out. Now, state functions can't move, that's for sure. Public universities can't move, although they may think about hiring teachers from India one day, as I've predicted. But I don't know if it's really realistic, given the intimidation factors that go on for many of these workers in these really bad jobs, to become involved, to be organizing in a way that will change their working conditions, unless we're also enlarging and empowering a national movement at the same time. Because I believe workers in these red states have bad jobs and they want change too.
Yeah, there's many things to say in response to that. First, let me just say thank you to Eduardo. It's really been fun to do this with you, and thank you to CUNY Graduate Center for having me, and to Janet Gornick for setting this up, and to yourself. So thanks for having me here. This has been a lot of fun. Building national movement, sure, it sounds great, but it's kind of hard to do. I tend to want to focus in on, I'm someone that, has passed legislation at local and state levels, and so that's what I know. And I know that when you pass laws, it changes people's behavior. And sure, if you have a national movement, it helps you to pass the laws. So it's kind of a chicken or egg thing. But I think that, if you're smart and you're strategic and you find the policy proposals where you can build support around, and then that thing becomes a stepping stone to the next thing, that's the way it's going to be most effective, but it does take time. And if we're wanting quick fixes, I don't have any answers for it. We've gotten into this mess over the last 25, 30 years. And it's going to probably take that long to get out of it. So we better get going on it, because otherwise, like I said at the beginning, my fear is we're going to look back 20 years from now and we're going to say, we didn't get this right. We didn't realize what the potential problems were going to be, and we didn't anticipate what we needed to do, and so as a result, we didn't do it. And so now here we are stuck, we're all task rabbits and pushing buttons for low pay, and let's go see the gladiators tonight.
All right,
Right.
thank you, Stephen and Eduardo.